Dr. Rick Brown is the Deputy Director of the Australian Institute of Criminology. As a criminologist for 30 years, he has worked extensively on issues associated with crime prevention, community safety, and policing in Australia, the UK, and Republic of Ireland. His topic that he's going to present is the prevalence of domestic violence among women during the COVID-19 pandemic, findings from our survey of 15,000 women. Dr. Brown, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. Can I first express my thanks to KIC for hosting this conference, which I'm sure you'll agree is addressing some of the really important issues that we're all dealing with, and thanks to Matthew Hudson for the overview that you've just provided to us too. Here at the AIC, we've been conducting research on a wide range of issues associated with COVID-19, including the availability of medical products on the darknet, gambling, drug markets, and fraud. But our greatest investment to date has been on exploring issues associated with impacts on domestic violence. So this presentation provides some of the just the high-level findings from a survey that the AIC has conducted to explore women's experiences of domestic violence during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge my brilliant co-authors for on this work, Hayley Boxall and Anthony Morgan, who really did all the hard work in bringing this together by developing the survey, analysing the data, as well as writing the final report. So this presentation is very much based on their hard work, and I'm very grateful for their continued work on this project. Next slide, please. So I want to start by just taking you back a few months to late March, which was when we started to see an escalation in cases of COVID-19 in Australia. Governments at the state and territory, as well as the national level, responded by introducing a range of policy measures to prevent the spread of the virus. National action started from 13th of March with a ban on large gatherings. This was quickly followed by a series of restrictions that progressively restricted movement and social gatherings and closed down a significant portion of the economy. This resulted in people spending much more time in their homes and with their immediate family and unable to visit friends or see other family members. Now, the social isolation this created soon led to concerns being expressed for women's safety, with reports of increased domestic violence coming from those working in that sector. So it's with that backdrop that we decided to conduct this study. Next slide, please. So this survey set out to answer the following question: what was the prevalence and nature of domestic violence experienced by Australian women during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic? Next slide, please. The survey was conducted in May using an online panel of women who already signed up to respond to online surveys of this kind. We drew on a range of existing questionnaires to develop questions on violence and abuse, help seeking, financial stress, and social isolation. But here I'm just going to focus on the experiences of violence and abuse. We also took great care to keep the survey short and to encourage women to be in a safe space when they were completing the survey. We very much took the safety of the women responding extremely seriously. Next slide, please. The survey included measures of both physical and non-physical forms of violence and abuse. We asked about types of physical violence and sexual violence, and we also asked about types of emotionally abusive, harassing, or controlling behaviour. Our measure of coercive control required a pattern of behaviour demonstrating 3 or more forms of emotionally abusive, harassing, or controlling behaviours. And the survey also asked about whether the violence was by a current or former cohabiting partner, and also included attempted behaviours and face-to-face threats. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the survey was designed to be representative at the national level with stratification by age and state. So here you can see the proportion of the sample for each Australian state and territory. And as you can see, much of the sample came from the eastern states of New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, which really just reflects the population distribution in Australia. Now, the sample isn't representative within states, so we very much resisted states level breakdowns in the analysis that we've conducted. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get on to looking at some of the findings from the survey. So to start with, 4.2% of the women we surveyed had experienced physical violence and 2.2% had experienced sexual violence in the 3 months prior to the survey. When emotionally abusive, harassing and controlling behaviours were concerned, 11.6% experienced these kinds of behaviours from their partner, while almost 6% experienced coercive control. But these figures include both women in a relationship as well as those who were not. When we focused on our sample of 7,700 women in a cohabiting relationship, we found much higher levels of violence and abuse. Next slide, please. In fact, in each case, the prevalence of violence or abuse was about double that for women overall. So here we can see that women in a cohabiting relationship, for them, 8.2% experienced physical violence, 4.2% experienced sexual violence, 22.4% experienced emotionally abusive, harassing or controlling behaviours, while 11.1% experienced a pattern of coercive control. Next slide, please. The survey covered a wide range of different types of victimization, and I thought I'd just show you a few of the types of behaviors that women were subject to. So 1.9% of women were strangled, choked, or grabbed around the neck. 1.6% of women were hit with a weapon, beaten, stabbed, or shot. 2.6% of women were stalked either online or in person. 2.7% of women said their partner had threatened to hurt themselves, and 3.3% of women said their partner had accused them of having an affair. And these were just a few of the many types of behaviours that we were exploring in the survey. Next slide, please. Now, women were experiencing really complex forms of domestic violence, and many experienced multiple forms of violence or abuse. Among those who experienced violence or abuse, over half, that's 51.6%, had experienced physical or sexual violence and coercive control. In contrast, relatively few experienced just physical or sexual violence, and this group made up just 15.5% of those experiencing violence or abuse. Next slide, please. Now, one of the issues we have with the survey is that some women would have experienced domestic violence even without there having been a pandemic. So we really tried to, given that this was a cross-sectional survey, it's difficult to explore that in more detail, but really tried to examine whether the experiences could be more closely associated with the onset of COVID-19. Now, if we take a look at the green bars here, we see that among those who experienced physical or sexual violence, 1/3, that's 33.1%, experienced violence from their partner for the first time. And among those experiencing coercive control, 1 in 5, or 19.9%, were experiencing it for the first time. Now, it's also worrying to note here that most did in fact experience ongoing patterns of violence or abuse. So among those that experienced violence, we see that 60.9% of those that experienced physical or sexual violence in the 3 months prior to the survey had in fact experienced similar violence prior to the pandemic. And the figure's even higher for those experiencing coercive control in the previous 3 months. In their case, 74.2% had experienced coercive controlling behaviours prior to the pandemic. So I want to focus a bit more on those that experienced prior violence or coercive control. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows those women experiencing ongoing patterns of violence and abuse, the ones that made up the largest group in the previous slide. And I want you again focus on the green bars here. Here we can see that around half of those who had experienced physical or sexual violence or coercive control experienced an escalation in the frequency or severity of violence and abuse. In contrast, very few women experiencing prior violence or abuse said that their violence had decreased during the pandemic. This group made up just 14% of those experiencing ongoing violence or abuse. Next slide, please. So the final statistic I just wanted to draw your attention to is this finding that among women experiencing violence or abuse from a former or current partner in the 3 months prior to the survey, 2/3 had experienced either an onset or an escalation in the frequency or severity of such behaviors. That, for us, provides some important information that suggests the pandemic coincided with some really negative experiences for a portion of women in Australia. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, this report is available on our website, along with a separate appendix which provides much more information about the methodology for the study. And we're currently undertaking some further reanalysis of the data to answer some important policy questions. Thank you.